Protests have been banned in Bahrain as the military tries to wrest back control of the country's capital. It follows a violent crackdown on anti-government demonstrations overnight. Human rights workers say 5 people were killed when hundreds of heavily armed riot police fired shotguns, tear gas and grenades at pro-democracy protesters who were camped in the centre of Manama. Hospitals have been inundated with the wounded and the dying. It is the latest in a wave of protests spreading across the Middle East and North Africa. A warning, this report from our international editor Lindsay Hilson contains images you may find disturbing.
Their plan was to recreate Cairo's Tahrir Square at the Pearl Roundabout in Manama. But the security forces moved against them in the early hours. Amateur footage shows the chaos as tear gas and birdshot were unleashed. The several hundred protesters were mostly sleeping at the time in their tents.
We didn't attack anyone. We were sleeping and hoping for the best. We didn't expect the police to attack us so late at night. It was so sudden.
Bahrain television showed the official version of events. The voiceover says the police gave warnings and used minimum force. He talks of casualties amongst the police, not the protesters. But the scene at the hospital a short while later shows the anger and desperation of the demonstrators. They say that doctors were initially prevented from treating the injured and that scores of people are missing, feared dead.
We have children and we came in peace. The police are thieves. They destroyed our tents and threatened us and our children with their weapons. They took down our tent. We saw with our own eyes how they killed the martyrs. We watched them kill and beat up the protesters.
Some of the injuries are horrific. A human rights worker told Channel 4 News that the police used birdshot at close range, and this was the result. Again, the government countered with its own version. They say these are policemen injured by protesters. Later they displayed on TV daggers and swords which they say they seized, although there's been no footage which shows the protesters carrying any weapons. Later in the day, a pro-government demonstration was organised. Undoubtedly, some Bahraini citizens do support King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, but the Shia majority suffer discrimination, and young people are disappointed that there's been so little political and social reform. Tanks are now on the streets of Manama, the army ready to crush any further unrest.
The Central Command of the Bahrain Defence Forces announces that military forces have deployed in the capital in order to take necessary procedures to protect citizens and residents, to protect their rights and their properties from all acts of violence.
This evening, Gulf foreign ministers gathered in Manama for a scheduled meeting. Each one anxious that the unrest will spread, that princes and kings will prove as vulnerable as the presidents of Tunisia and Egypt. And down the road, at the hospital, protesters kept their noisy vigil, waiting for news of the wounded and demanding the overthrow of Bahrain's ruling dynasty.
Well, earlier I spoke to Mariam Al-Khawaja from the Bahrain Centre for Human Rights. She was among the protesters this morning, and I asked her what she saw when the riot police and soldiers arrived.
Without any prior warning or notification, the riot police came out of their jeeps and they just started shooting at the protesters who had started gathering in the middle of the roundabout. They were shooting rubber bullets, tear gas, and bird shotgun. And the attack was very violent. People started chanting peaceful, peaceful after they started shooting, and they started retreating to the back of the roundabout away from the bridge. But the thing is, there were riot police coming from the backside as well, and they started shooting as well. And the shooting was continuous. It didn't stop. So people started running, and this is when, like, I saw a woman running, trying to cling on to their kids, trying to get them out of there.
So are you saying there was literally no warning before the shots fired? They weren't firing at people who were fighting back or anything like that?
There was literally no warning, and there were no clashes. The fact that the U.S. statements are talking about violence from both sides and about that both sides need to stop the violence, I believe is very unacceptable, and I think it's wrong, and it actually helps excuse the behavior of the riot police here, where they've been using unnecessary excessive violence against peaceful protesters.
Do you believe, like Egypt, the protesters will keep coming back and not give up? Or is this a situation in which the state could put down this revolution?
Well, right now it's kind of difficult to tell. People are very, very angry. When I was at the hospital later, about half an hour after I got out, I went to the hospital to document the injuries and possible deaths. And people were screaming, people were crying. One man was screaming, "Is this how the king shows us his condolences for the first two deaths? Is this how he shows us that he's going to initiate an investigation committee into the first two deaths? Is that by creating more deaths?"